Good evening, good afternoon, and for some of you also good morning. Welcome to this webinar organized by United Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. My name is Elizabeth Vroom, and I will chair this webinar. First of all, I would like to congratulate PTC for this landmark in the history of DMD drug development, the first drug for DMD ever receiving a positive opinion by the CHMP. That is great news for the entire Duchenne community. Dr. Robert Spiegel, Chief Medical Officer of PTC Therapeutics, will present an overview of the positive opinion by the Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use of the European Medicines Agency regarding the company's application for conditional marketing authorization of Translarna, so far known as Ataluren, for the treatment of nonsense mutation in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and what this decision means for families living in and outside the EU. After his presentation, PTC will answer the questions sent in by patient organizations around the globe, and you will be placed on mute, but you can still give comments or ask questions. You'll see the chat box in the screen below at the left side. These questions that may appear in the chat box, however, cannot be answered during the webinar. We already asked PTC to answer more than 25 questions in the time slot we have, but you will receive an answer later and by email. So, Dr. Spiegel, may I invite you to start your presentation?
Certainly. So thank you very much, Elizabeth, for hosting this call, and welcome to everybody, and good afternoon or good evening regarding where you may be. So we're very pleased today to be able to give you an update on Ataluren, and particularly to give you some insight into the recent CHMP vote and what it means for PTC and for the patients in the EU in particular. We begin with a statement that's called a forward-looking statement. PTC is a public company in the United States, and we have to say that some of the statements I'll be making do apply to future events and what's called forward-looking statements that have risks and uncertainties, and this is simply a statement for SEC purposes to make you aware of that. But importantly, as we move through this set of slides, what I'll be covering this afternoon after this welcome is a very brief statement about the developmental history and how we've come to the point we are at today, and then a review of the conditional approval option in general and what it has meant for us recently, with a summary of the CHMP, the Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use, meeting that occurred recently and what that decision was and what it means going forward. I'll be summarizing some of the key elements of the CHMP opinion, and then importantly for everyone on the phone, I'll try to summarize what we see as next steps. I should say that this is all very new for many of us, and so some of the responses I have to your questions will be very early considerations. We don't have all the answers yet, but we wanted to spend today giving you our best understanding of where we are and what are some of the things likely to happen next. So I want to just begin with this slide, which is important for PTC, for Translarna, which is now the brand name for what you've known and we've known as Ataluren. It will be known as Translarna. But I think this single slide has a lot of importance to the whole DMD community. It shows that at least the history within PTC was that the discovery of Ataluren actually started in 1998, and it's not atypical for any new drug to really take that long. It's hard for a lot of people to understand, but the basic biology that began the process of what turned out to be the molecule Ataluren started that far back. And then the first studies in man, called phase 1 studies, began in 2004, just to determine the right dose and the safety of the product. And then in 2005, we conducted what we call a phase 2A study with 38 patients who were dosed for about 28 days, and that was able to give evidence that exposure to Ataluren actually resulted in the production of dystrophin, and that, of course, was very encouraging for us to go forward and then start what we've called the phase 2B or study 007. And it's important to remember that that study began back in 2007 when very little was known about how to develop a drug in this condition. No one had ever used a 6-minute walk test before for this kind of study. There were some questions about whether it was even safe and how reproducible the results would be. So looking back, PTC actually took a lot of risks and was the first to think that we might be able to do a study that would show the activity of a new product. And I say that because if you look at what happened in subsequent years, it really wasn't until about 2011 that other groups began to publish literature and publish data about what would be expected in the natural history. And this has become important recently to put our own results in the perspective of what we now understand would be the normal progression and what we call the natural history of the disease. And as you know, only in 2013 did we begin a phase 3 trial, what we now call the ACT-DMD trial, which is a new randomized controlled trial, which we'll talk about a little bit and which will be critical to get the results of both to fulfill the conditions of the conditional approval and to provide data for a full filing both in the EU and in the US and in the rest of the world. And I also note that only in 2013 did the EMA issue draft guidelines for how any company should think about developing a drug in Duchenne. So all of that goes to say that when PTC started, there were many, many unknowns, and I think fortunately we believe part of what went into the decision-making at the CHMP earlier this month was really based on an understanding that a lot of the data we had has been accumulated in a period where there wasn't certainty about how to develop a drug and what would be an expected result of an active drug. At this point, we have exposed over 650 both patients and healthy volunteers in our early studies. So although DMD is considered a very rare disease, we thought this was a considerable database to help have some confidence in what the safety of the drug would be. And in fact, we do think the safety profile is favorable, and throughout our interactions with the health authorities, we've been fortunate that there were not major concerns about the safety of the drug. And we've talked about briefly that we went through a classic drug development scheme where phase 2A was able to demonstrate that dystrophin could be expressed in boys who were exposed to Ataluren. That in phase 2B, we were able to show a clinical meaningful benefit in the 6-minute walk test as compared to the placebo arm in that study, as well as natural history data that's now available, and that we're now in the midst of rolling out the phase 3 ACT-DMD trial, which is currently meeting enrollment projections, but it's very important that we complete the enrollment and then complete the 48 weeks of study in all of those boys to finish that study. So I want to spend a few moments talking about what does conditional approval mean. Now, this next slide shows the regulatory definition in the European Union of what products are eligible for conditional approval. And it states in the regulations that the medicinal product must belong to at least one of the following categories for conditional marketing authorization. Number one, that it's intended for a seriously debilitating or life-threatening disease. Number two, that it could be a product to be used in emergency situations. Or number three, that it is an orphan medicinal product intended for use in a rare orphan condition. And obviously, Translarna meets number 1 and 3, which you only need to meet 1 to be able to go forward under review as a possible candidate for conditional approval. Now that we've received it, let me just be very clear about what conditional marketing authorization means. It's commonly known as conditional approval, this conditional marketing authorization, and it can be granted based on less than comprehensive clinical data if the risk-benefit is positive and pending post-approval confirmation. So each of those concepts is very important to where we've ended up, and that means that in the EU, they wrote these regulations with the concept that a product could come forward when it didn't have all of the information that would be necessary to achieve a full approval, but with less than comprehensive data, if there was enough evidence to conclude that there is benefit and the risk-benefit is positive, then they can grant approval, but then there is an obligation that whatever is not the basis for a full approval will be provided by the company. So for Translarna, what this means is the sole condition of our conditional marketing authorization is the completion of the confirmatory phase 3 study, which we call ACT-DMD. And in order to maintain a conditional approval, PTC must each year submit evidence of progress toward collecting that comprehensive clinical data. And again, this is important because there have been examples in the past when the EU and in some cases the FDA also has granted early approval expecting follow-up data and been disappointed about how long it took for that confirmatory data to come through. And we believe one of the factors that led to the positive vote, which we've recently received, was that we convinced them that this confirmatory study is very well underway and will be able to produce results in a relatively near-term time frame. This just, next slide, graphically shows the timing, and what I wanted you to see that is the balance here shows that when the EMA weighed the risk to benefit and gave us a vote for positive approval, it occurs now in the middle of 2014 with the expectation that the Phase 3 ACT-DMD study, which is drawn as a blue arrow on the top, will both complete enrollment and then will complete the trial sometime in 2015 and allow us to then file that and achieve a full approval, or at least a request for granting the full approval in 2016. And what we've just shown you here is, I think what the intent of this law is that it allows boys with DMD to get access to the drug that much earlier, hopefully in some countries even by the end of this year, where they would otherwise have had to wait until 2016 or 2017 to be able to get access to the drug. So I'm going to very briefly walk through the efficacy results that were presented by the company and reviewed by the CHMP, which we felt demonstrated a treatment effect of the drug that was considerable enough to grant this positive benefit to risk evaluation. So some of you who have heard us speak before have seen this slide, which shows the primary endpoint that was pre-specified in the protocol. That is the difference in the 6-minute walk, in this case shown in 2 lines. The patients who were on placebo decreased 44 meters from their baseline over the course of a year in their 6-minute walk result, whereas the boys who were on Translarna or Ataluren only decreased 12.9 meters for a 30-meter mean difference between the Ataluren-treated patients and the placebo-treated patients. And this was within the expectation that we thought the study was designed to be large enough to show with confidence that about a 30-meter difference could be found if the drug was active. However, as you see at the bottom, I would point out that the p-value for the primary analysis was 0.0561, and normally regulators like to see a p-value of 0.05 to feel that a drug has proven with statistical significance its effectiveness. However, we had a number of other analyses which were very helpful in evaluating the treatment effect of Ataluren. This was a pre-specified analysis where we tried to look not just at the mean change of all the boys in each group, but we defined a boy as progressing if during the course of a year his performance in the 6-minute walk test decreased 10% from where he had started and was sustained at less than 10%. And using that definition, 44% of the boys in the bottom gray line on placebo had progressed by the end of a year, whereas only 26% of the boys on the 10-10-20 dose of Ataluren had progressed. And we note in the blue box here that we believe Ataluren was effective with separation between the 2 groups occurring early and remaining sustained as a separation between the outcomes in the 2 groups. Now, what I'm going to show you in the next few slides, there's some other ways these results were put in perspective. What we show in the gray bars here is the difference in 6-minute walk that has been seen in other trials with other drugs that were used in conditions that were also rare orphan diseases, but there was a regulatory precedent for somewhere between 23 and 38 meters to be considered a meaningful difference in 6-minute walk test. And as you can see, the primary results of Ataluren in the overall population, what I showed you in previous slides, was a 31.3 meter difference, and that fell pretty comfortably within the range that the regulators had previously seen when they've approved other drugs for rare conditions. However, I'm going to be talking about some subgroups that we identified within the population of patients studied in the 007 trial. And if you look at boys who we now define as being in the decline phase of DMD, saw a 50-meter difference in those groups between Ataluren treatment and placebo treatment. And on the top, we also went back and looked at boys who started the study at less than 350 meters in their baseline 6-minute walk test, which would be a subgroup we would consider more severe. And in that group of patients, there was a 68-meter difference between the Ataluren-treated boys on average and the placebo-treated boys. So we thought that was very important to say, in the group that's most likely to show a change and a decrement during a year of study, can Ataluren show its effect? And indeed, it showed more of an effect than it did when we looked at the overall population. We also had a number of secondary endpoints that had been designed in this study, and they all trended in the same direction, suggesting that Ataluren was having a positive benefit. So this is a fairly complicated slide. On the left-hand side, there are 6 lines that show the results of the time function test. The first 2 are the 10-meter walk-run. The next 2 bars are the climbing stairs results in a time function test, and then descending stairs results. And for each of these, the white bar shows how much the placebo group changed from baseline. In this case, if you have more seconds that it takes you to perform these activities, it's a worsening of your condition, whereas there was less worsening in the black boxes in boys who had taken Ataluren. And we then looked at these same kinds of results in the same subgroups that I just mentioned to you, a decline phase subgroup that had a few criteria to put them in the decline phase group, and there was a greater effect of the Ataluren compared to placebo in that group. And similarly, on the right-hand side of this slide, when we look at those boys who, by the predefined definition of less than 350 meters in their 6-minute walk at baseline, again, you see a much more marked decline in the placebo group and less of a decline in the Ataluren group. So again, these subgroups were showing more benefit of Ataluren, not just in the 6-minute walk test, but also in these frequently administered time function tests. There were, as you can imagine, many other questions we were asked and ways we were asked to look at our data to review the safety and determine how robust the efficacy was from the phase 2b trial. But we don't have time to permit that, but we will be presenting that in scientific forums in the coming months. But what I just wanted to add as a single slide was, as I mentioned, the fact that Ataluren has a considerable database with about 650 patients who have now been studied across all of the studies that have been performed, including, as you know, we also are doing studies with Translarna in cystic fibrosis. But if we take all the patients, it's about 650 patients who have been exposed, and many of them have been exposed for long term. So over 50% of the patients have been exposed for more than 2 years. And that also is something that regulators like to look at to be comfortable that there are unlikely to be cumulative safety problems or safety problems that only show up later. And although that's certainly not impossible, the data to date looks very reassuring. The most common adverse effects that we've seen are side effects. Looking at those that are reported in more than 10% of patients, tended to be headache, nausea, and vomiting. These might have been produced by just taking the Translarna 3 times a day, or if you do any studies in pediatric populations, even the placebo groups can have these types of symptoms reported at a rate of 10% or more. In the entire program, few treatment-related serious adverse events have occurred, and as evidence of that, no patients in the Study 007 DMD trial discontinued the study due to an adverse event. I will mention that our final labeling will reflect that concomitant use of intravenous aminoglycosides is contraindicated. Aminoglycosides are a certain type of antibiotic. We actually saw this occur in our cystic fibrosis studies where patients quite commonly require antibiotics, and we saw that when patients took this type of antibiotic together with Translarna, there were some events where we saw increases in their blood tests which measure their kidney or renal function. And so the label, even for DMD, will say that you should not take intravenous use of this type of antibiotic while you're taking Translarna. All of the safety that I'm talking about right now and that will be described in the label is subject to additional monitoring once the drug is available through conditional or full approval, to allow the authorities to see any rapid identification of any new safety information. And we will have what's called a risk management plan, and we will have a plan for collecting side effects continuously in patients who are taking the drug through normal pharmacovigilance activities. And also, again, as reassurance for why conditional approval can be granted, it will also require an annual renewal where the company will have to present updated data in safety that we've seen in any patients who are exposed and in our ongoing trials. And, of course, the conditional approval requires data from the new study, which is enrolling about 220 patients who are randomized to placebo or Ataluren. So we will have another large database to provide to confirm the safety of the product. So I'm sure many of you are asking this question, why did the CHMP grant a conditional marketing authorization at that time? And based on the written conclusion that we received, it was in the CHMP's view, based on the current evidence, which is that Translarna is generally well tolerated, that there is some evidence of effectiveness when it's used at the dose of 40 milligrams a day or 10, 10, 20, given over 3 times a day, that the benefits of Translarna outweigh the risk, that the way the medicine works is plausible, that is, that it seems likely that from what we understand about the drug that it does produce dystrophin and that it should be able to help boys slow the progress of Duchenne. It was recognized that Duchenne is a serious disease and there is an unmet medical need, and that the data were sufficient to recommend a conditional marketing authorization under the principles that I summarized quickly a few moments ago. So what does conditional approval mean? The exact indication that we will be granted, we think when the final letter comes out, is that Translarna is indicated for the treatment of Duchenne muscular dystrophy resulting from a nonsense mutation in the dystrophin gene in ambulatory patients aged 5 years and older. Efficacy has not been demonstrated in non-ambulatory patients. And secondly, the presence of a nonsense mutation in the dystrophin gene should be determined by genetic testing. So this is the exact wording that will appear in the label and that doctors will be aware of when they wish to prescribe the drug. And I know Elizabeth has some questions that have already been collected that I'll elaborate on this a little bit more later. As far as next steps, obviously, a key next step is to complete the ACT-DMD Phase 3 study. Completion of that, of enrollment in that study remains a prime focus for us at PTC. The enrollment has been on track, and we've stated that we expect enrollment to be completed in the middle of this year, and we're on track to do that. We need to complete this study to maintain conditional approval. And if we do get positive results when this study is completed and reported to the authorities, we would use that to submit for full approval in the EU and the U.S. and other countries around the world. As far as commercial availability, once the vote occurs, which is what happened a couple weeks ago, you still need to get formal European ratification. The European Commission has to sign off and deliver a letter to us saying the conditional marketing authorization has been granted. That can take up to 3 months for that final certification to occur. And then, in all countries, pricing and reimbursement approval is still needed, and that process varies from country to country and can typically take from a few months to as long as a year and a half. So, I know many of you have sent some questions directly to us and to Elizabeth, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but basically what's on this slide is the process that as soon as we receive that final letter, we need to start the process country by country to go through the local requirements in order to have the drug authorized and reimbursement approved on a country-by-country basis throughout the EU. So with that, I think we'll turn to questions. And Elizabeth, if you want to start us out, we'll try to stay on track so we can get to as many as possible today.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you for everything so far. Yeah, of course, the first question is, what is Translarna? I think that's good to mention maybe.
So I'll be brief to make sure we spend enough time on all the questions. Translarna is the brand name. It's an invented name for Ataluren, and that's the brand name that it will be used in all the countries in Europe.
And how soon will Translarna be available?
So obviously a question everybody wants to know.
Yeah.
As I said, the European Commission will review the positive opinion from the CHMP, and it generally delivers its final decision within 3 months. And then upon a positive EC decision, PTC needs to complete the necessary filings for pricing and reimbursement in each of the 28 countries that are member states of the European Union, and that also is extended to the European Economic Area, which includes Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. And the process varies from country to country and typically can take from a few months to a year and a half, but PTC will be making every effort to advance this process as quickly as allowed in each country.
And then which patients will be available to get Translarna?
So, as I stated, according to the label recommended by the CHMP as part of its positive opinion, Translarna will be made available through this conditional approval for boys with DMD due to a documented nonsense mutation who are 5 years of age or older and ambulatory.
And then how about the boys under 5 or those who are non-ambulatory?
So we will continue to engage with the regulators to determine a path forward so that we will be able to provide access for all the patients who may benefit from Translarna. And I think you have some other questions where we can expand a little bit about what we're thinking, but that will, the basic answer to your question is it's going to require us continuing to work with the regulators to say how do you expand from the current label we have.
And what about the boys and the young men, meanwhile, in the extension studies who are receiving Translarna but are non-ambulatory?
So our intention is that boys who are receiving Translarna in an extension study will be able to remain in those studies until Translarna is commercially available in that country. So when the actual pricing is completed and other boys are able to get the drug if they're qualified, the boys in the extension study will be able to remain on a country-by-country basis on the extension studies until that occurs.
And then another burning question, how much will it cost? Is the price, can you say anything about the price of Translarna?
So the answer is that the price has not been determined, but we anticipate that the pricing will be consistent with what's usual for innovative new therapies for very rare diseases.
And will the boys still have to come for frequent testing?
So, those boys who are now participating in an extension trial will continue to participate with whatever testing that protocol calls for until the Translarna is commercially available in their country. But once the Translarna is commercially available, the care of the boys will be provided by a treating physician, and whatever testing that doctor feels is appropriate to monitor the boys would be conducted. There will be some recommendations in the label for yearly monitoring of blood tests, but the actual testing will be between the physician and the patient.
And how will the CHMP decision affect the ongoing clinical trial, the ACT-DMD trial?
So we hope that it has no effect. The Ataluren confirmatory trial in DMD, the ACT-DMD trial, will continue, and it's a very important priority for PTC. Patients who are participating in this placebo-controlled study should continue and complete their 48 weeks of randomized blinded drug administration, and completion of the ACT-DMD trial is crucial to the further development and commercialization of Translarna. Now, assuming the results of the ACT-DMD trial are positive, that data will be submitted to support our applications for full approval in both the EU and the U.S., and it would serve as a basis for approvals in other countries as well.
Okay. So are you concerned about boys not entering a placebo-controlled trial if they can get Translarna through conditional approval?
Well, there was concern even voiced by the CHMP about that question, but we're now confident that we're going to be able to complete this important clinical trial. We're well on track to complete enrollment by mid-2014, and most of the new enrollees are expected to be from countries outside of the European Union. In addition, we expect that by the time Translarna is available for general use by clinicians in each country following that national funding negotiation that I mentioned, Most of the boys who have been enrolled at trial sites in the European Union will have completed the trial, and they'll be in the extension study where they'll already be receiving Translarna.
Okay, thank you. So that won't be a problem. And then will this decision affect the ACT-DMD extension study or the other ongoing extension studies?
So we intend that boys in an extension study will be able to remain in such a study until Translarna is commercially available in their country. And as I said, we actually think the information we're getting from these extension studies is very important and may be very important in the future. So it's certainly, our intention to keep the extension studies going as best we can.
When do you think you will get full approval for Translarna in DMD?
We think the full approval is possible in 2016.
Okay. And then can citizens of other countries buy Translarna in Europe, or what if they want to move there?
So there's a whole series of interesting questions we've already been asked about this. What I would say is that Translarna will only be available in Europe through national health systems, not for sale directly to patients. And as many of you know, national health coverage in Europe varies by country, and it's often contingent on residency or citizenship requirements. So parents may want to check with the local consulate in their country they're inquiring about to learn more about the regulations in that country. Some non-EU countries around the world may allow named patient use of Translarna based on the EU approval, and this needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And as I'll say at the end of this call, if some of the listeners have specific questions, we'll give you a website where we might be able to help you get some answers to this important question.
Because are you going to talk to the FDA in the light of this decision? Will you be filing for approval, or have you already filed?
So we're considering all of our options in the United States to determine the best regulatory path forward, and we do expect to engage in further discussions with the FDA.
Because when do you expect to get Translarna approved in the U.S.?
Well, based on our estimates of the ACT-DMD data availability, we expect to be able to submit a new drug application for full marketing authorization of Translarna for NMDMD in the United States in 2016.
And how long after Translarna is fully approved do you expect to have it on the market?
So let me make sure everyone understands this, and certainly those of you who are listening in the European Union. In the EU, Translarna will become available via the conditional approval prior to full approval, so there shouldn't be any delay in the market availability at the time we have full approval. After approval in the United States, eventually, Translarna would be available within a few months because we would need to work with health insurance companies to ensure that it's included in their formularies.
And will conditional approval be available in other countries? And why can't they get conditional approval in the U.S.?
So while we pursue the marketing authorization in other countries, we remain committed to support the DMD community by providing access through early access programs. And once there's a conditional marketing authorization for a drug in the EU, there are many other countries in Asia and South America, for example, as well as in some non-EU members in Europe who may choose to provide an early access program, or sometimes this is through what's called a named patient protocol, which means individual applications can be made for access to the drug. Such requests are usually assessed on a case-by-case basis. We will work with the health authorities in those countries that request local availability. And in the United States, conditional approval, as I described it earlier, as it's defined by regulation in the European Union, is not an option offered by the FDA.
Yes. And can you disclose how the different countries voted?
So once the European Union votes on whether or not to ratify the CHMP positive opinion, which, as I said, should occur within a few months, then this information will be publicly available.
Okay, right. And why doesn't conditional approval include non-ambulatory boys?
Yeah, so I know that this was likely to be a question that I didn't address directly when we went through the slides. So the CHMP felt that because the Phase 2B trial, the 007 trial, was performed only in ambulatory patients and it used ambulatory-based measures of efficacy, such as the 6-minute walk test, they felt that PTC did not have sufficient data regarding Translarna's use in non-ambulatory boys. But we continue to gather data on response to Ataluren in the non-ambulatory boys in our extension studies, and hopefully we may be able to collect that data and present it to the authorities in the future.
And will you have a charity program in the EU if countries refuse to reimburse for the drug?
So we're investigating all the ways in which we can assure that all boys with nonsense mutation DMD who could potentially benefit from Translarna can receive it.
Okay, right. And what hurdles do you see in making the drug available in the European countries?
Well, that's a good question, Elizabeth. We don't see specific hurdles, but we recognize that discussions regarding the filings for pricing and reimbursement take time. After the ratification by the European Commission, we'll be entering into pricing and reimbursement discussions with the 31 countries that are covered by the conditional approval. And each of them has its own process, and we really can't predict how long they will take. Historically, the process varies from country to country, and even with very rare drugs destined for patients with very rare or orphan diseases, it can typically take from a few months to a year and a half. But we'll be making every effort to advance the process as quickly as possible and as allowed by each country. And do you expect to have enough supply and the right packaging for each country? Yes, we do. So we've paid careful attention to that, and I'm pleased to say we don't anticipate any supply issues. Okay. And then a question which really comes from all sides. Can you please collect data about non-ambulatory boys in your clinical trials so conditional approval can be expanded? So yes, as I've stated, we're already collecting that data in our extension studies for the boys, and those studies are for boys who participated in prior Ataluren DMD trials outside of the U.S., and we will assess the results that we're collecting there for regulatory purposes. Is there anything parents and patient advocacy groups can do to get the label expanded? Well, we certainly thank you for your willingness to help. Parents and patient advocacy groups play a very important role in the public education and awareness about DMD, and we think that was true as we went through the review process in Europe. And the need for treatment for all boys and young men affected by it can never be understated. However, in this regard, there's no specific action by advocacy groups that we would encourage at this time for expansion of the label. And when will Ataluren be available in countries outside of the EU? So at this time, the CHMP has only rendered a positive opinion for Ataluren availability in Europe, and that still needs to be ratified officially by the European Commission. I mentioned that Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway are covered by the CHMP decisions, and we're exploring all the regulatory paths in other non-EU countries to see what can be done based on this recommendation from the CHMP. And do you know which countries in the EU will be receiving Translarna first? So after the ratification by the EC, our team will be entering into pricing and reimbursement discussions with each EU member state, and each of them has its own process, and we can't predict which will be the first to complete them. The process varies from country to country, and as I said, we're hopeful that in some it can take just a few months, but in some historically it's taken up to a year and a half. But we'll be making every effort to advance the process as quickly as is allowed in each country. And the last, but definitely not the least, it's an important question everybody has asked. What was different about this time versus the previous discussion with the CHMP? Well, based on the questions that the CHMP raised during their initial review, PTC was able to show that we're now much closer to completing the enrollment of the confirmatory ACT-DMD study, and we provided evidence of our ability to complete that study in the context of commercial availability of Translarna. So that was a specific concern of the CHMP, and we believe we were able to address that and show them that the enrollment is continuing very well. And as I said briefly, we have projections that show that by the time the full process to make the drug commercially available is complete, most of the boys in the European Union countries will already have completed the study. We also showed a wide range of data analyses, which included the overall population, the population that was enriched for patients in what we call the decline phase, and also the results which I briefly showed you in the pre-specified subgroup of patients with a baseline 6-minute walk test of less than 350 meters. And all of these provided evidence of Ataluren's efficacy. We also shared the data that I showed you some of about secondary endpoints, such as time function tests on the 10-meter run-walk, the 4-stair climb, and the 4-stair descend. And they provided further support of Ataluren's activity in slowing DMD progression relative to placebo. And finally, if you recall the slide I showed at the beginning of this slide presentation, we were able to bring in natural history data, some of which had only recently been published, which confirmed that our comparisons to natural history were appropriate and that the performance of the patients on placebo in our study was similar to what has now been seen in the natural history. And I think that also was useful in helping the CHMP appreciate the efficacy that we were trying to demonstrate from our study 007.
Great. Thank you so much for answering all these questions. And I think we can show now an email address where people can send their question. If they have remaining questions, they can send them to you, and you promise to answer them all. Thank you so much again for all you're doing, and thank you so much for spending time with us and sharing all your answers to the questions the community asked. Thank you so much.
Okay, so let me just remind everyone, Elizabeth, thank you again very much for hosting this. What I'm showing here is an email address, not a website, medinfo@ptcbio.com. And this webinar will be posted with audio on the PPMD website for anyone who could not call in or who wants to see it again.
Okay, thank you. So then everybody have a good evening, have a good afternoon, and have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.